Hello, my name is Johan, and I've lived in Brazil since I was little. My maternal family is from Argentina, and although I have never personally witnessed anything supernatural, I don't disbelieve the stories people tell. According to my mother, she and her family experienced something frightening in 1970, and it's this story that I want to share with you. That year, my grandparents made a decision that would change their lives forever. They bought a house in the city so my uncles and my mother could study. Until then, they lived on a farm about 20 kilometers away from the city. The new house was spacious but was located far from the city center and had no neighbors nearby. To further the sense of isolation, the house was situated at a crossroads that led directly to the local cemetery. Despite being in the urban area, the house had no electricity or running water and was the last house on the street, with the cemetery just ahead. This setting was enough to make anyone uncomfortable, and my uncles and my mother were no exception. They were afraid to leave the house at night, a fear that only grew with rumors that the house was not a good choice. Some people close to my grandparents mentioned that the house had a dark reputation, but with no money for another option, my grandparents decided to go ahead with the purchase. It was then that, shortly after moving in, they began to notice something strange. Something that, on Friday nights, seemed to emerge from the shadows, descending the road towards the cemetery. My mother, the eldest at just 16 years old, began to notice signs that something unusual was happening, and it was in this atmosphere of mystery and growing fear that my mother and my uncle Carlos decided to uncover what was really happening on Friday nights. Something unsettling began to occur. They discovered that a ghost would pass in front of the house, going down the road straight to the cemetery. My mother, the eldest of the children, at only 16 years old, began to notice the signs of the inexplicable. Sometimes, she would wake up in the middle of the night, disturbed by the insistent barking of the dog. It was unusual for him to bark without reason, especially at that hour of the night. In addition to the barking, she heard something even more disturbing. My grandmother's fervent prayers coming from inside her room. Intrigued and frightened, my mother would ask what was happening, but the answer was always the same: an urgent request for silence and the order to go back to sleep. However, it wasn't just the prayers that echoed through the house. Indistinct and disturbing voices came from outside, as if several people were gathered, praying, crying, and pleading in despair. These unsettling sounds always occurred on the last night from Friday to Saturday, like a macabre ritual repeated. Intrigued and terrified, my mother knew that something inexplicable was happening, and she was not alone. My uncle Carlos, younger and equally curious, shared the same fears and questions. One night, driven by a mixture of courage and curiosity, they decided they needed to find out what was really happening during those dark nights. After dinner, they prepared to sleep but decided to stay awake. The night was silent, almost tranquil, when, around midnight, they began to hear the sound of footsteps. The glow of a lantern moving through the house indicated that my grandmother was praying again. My mother and uncle jumped out of the bedroom window and circled around the house. When they reached the front, the sight they beheld left them petrified. Descending the road were several indistinct figures walking towards the cemetery, carrying a large black coffin. The people seemed to float above the ground, their old and tattered garments illuminated only by the faint light of the candles they held. The full moon in the sky illuminated the scene, revealing every grim detail. My uncle Carlos, younger and more impressionable, couldn't hold back a scream that pierced the night's silence. It was then that, suddenly, one of the figures, a woman with a pale face and empty eyes, broke away from the procession and began walking towards the house. The sight was chilling. The woman with the pale face and empty eyes approached the house, floating slightly above the ground. My mother and my uncle Carlos, frozen with fear, watched as she passed through the fence as if it were made of air. The silence of the night was interrupted only by the sound of the ghostly footsteps and the rapid beating of their hearts. My grandfather, awakened by Carlos's scream, quickly came out and, without looking at the woman, pulled my uncle into the house. The woman remained still, motionless, in front of the door. Minutes later, my uncle woke up not knowing where he was or what had happened. He saw my mother crying and my grandparents praying beside him. When he tried to get up, my grandfather held him down and whispered for him to stay silent. Outside, footsteps could be heard circling the house, accompanied by a litany in a strange language, like a constant lament that lasted until dawn. The next day, my grandparents explained that they had seen this a few times before, but that they should never go outside to look. The proper thing to do was to remain silent or pray, as the souls were following their destiny. My mother and my uncle were terrified but had no other house to live in. So, they stayed there, living with fear and the unknown. Time passed, and Friday night came again. My mother and my uncle knew the procession would pass once more. This time, they stayed inside, praying with my grandparents. The procession went down the road and stopped in front of the gate. The pale woman passed through the fence, and the sound of footsteps began again, accompanied by the litany that seemed like a chant of lament. The front door, split in two parts, allowed a partial view of the woman outside, as if she were waiting for an invitation to enter. The others in the procession waited in front of the gate, imposing and silent. That night seemed to last an eternity until, finally, the souls moved away. The next day, my grandparents decided to seek help. They went to the house of Seu Zuka, a man known in the region for dealing with strange things. He was a wise old man, full of knowledge about the supernatural and a close friend of my grandfather. After hearing the story, Seu Zuka suggested a plan. Seu Zuka explained that the only way to appease those restless souls was to follow the procession to the cemetery and light candles for them. So, on the last Friday of the following month, he arrived at our house early, bringing with him a calming yet unsettling presence. Around 8 in the evening, he began to prepare everything. He recited some powerful prayers, sprinkled an infusion around the house, and lit candles in front of the gate. The night seemed to drag on in a gloomy silence. The family chatted with Seu Zuka until close to midnight, trying to keep their minds occupied and ward off fear. When the clock struck midnight, a shiver ran down everyone's spine. Seu Zuka went out to the backyard, accompanied by my grandparents, and there they saw several red lights coming down the road. The spectral litanies and laments became audible, bringing a palpable aura of terror. With a lantern in hand, Seu Zuka stood in front of the house, awaiting the arrival of the procession. The scene was surreal. The spectral figures emerged from the crossroads, turning towards the cemetery. For the first time, everyone was there, witnessing the event. The figures were thin, almost translucent, with eyes that seemed to be just black holes. The sight was both fascinating and terrifying. The procession continued its path, and my grandparents, my uncles, my mother, and Seu Zuka followed them, keeping a safe distance. When they reached the cemetery, the procession entered and disappeared, as if swallowed by the darkness. There, at the foot of the cross, they lit candles and repeated the prayers that Seu Zuka had taught them, even without understanding the meaning of the words. Upon returning home, a sense of relief mixed with fear hung in the air. Seu Zuka revealed that one of the souls accompanying the procession had been the owner of the house that my grandparents bought. He assured them that from that day forward, the souls would leave our family in peace. However, one final task still needed to be completed to ensure that tranquility was restored. That night, he sat with my grandparents and explained that to keep the souls from returning, they needed to light candles at the foot of the cemetery cross every Good Friday and on All Souls' Day. This would maintain the pact and ensure that the souls would rest in peace. The following months passed without incident. The town began to grow, and the once deserted and eerie street started to come to life with new houses and lighting. The family could finally breathe a sigh of relief, but they never forgot the terrifying nights they had endured. My grandfather faithfully followed SCU Zuka's instructions. On the last Friday of the next month, as agreed, SCU Zuka arrived early at my grandparents' house, bringing with him the same unsettling calm. They spent the night chatting until close to midnight, when everyone felt a shiver. SCU Zuka went out to the backyard, and together with my grandparents, they once again witnessed the red lights descending the road and the haunted litanies filling the air. This time, the family was prepared. With candles lit and prayers repeated, they followed the procession at a safe distance, all the way to the cemetery. When the procession entered and disappeared, they lit the candles at the foot of the cross and repeated SCU Zuka's prayers. He explained that one of the souls had been the owner of the house, but now they would leave the family in peace. And so it was. From that day on, my grandparents kept the tradition of lighting candles at the cemetery every Good Friday and All Souls Day. The town continued to grow, and the once eerie street was now full of life. The house still belongs to our family, and my uncle lives there to this day. Whenever I visit, I remember the stories my mother told and imagine the scene of the procession descending the hill at the crossroads, passing in front of the house, and disappearing into the cemetery. This is the story of my family, a tale of courage, fear, and faith. And so, the souls finally found rest, and peace was restored.